40, 50 boats out there. You can't outfish every boat every week. And you'd come to the dock, and my dad would greet me at the dock. You top hook this week, son, you top hook. And he'd see it in my face. I couldn't even say the words, and he'd look at me. And he'd walk off, and he'd go home. And I don't have a right to be in my Father's presence if I can't beat everybody else at what I do. So just like in the perfect storm, I'd tell the crew, get the boat cleaned up, get it iced up, we're heading back out. For top hook, we'd stay home a few days. But if you can't beat everybody else at what they do, you don't have a right to be. You don't have a right to stay on land. Load the boat back up with ice, load it back up with fuel and bait, and head back offshore. And don't come back in until you're top hook and see when you're offshore now. It doesn't make any difference what the seas are, what the storms are. We're in a 44-foot fiberglass snapper fishing boat. Winds would come up 50, 60 miles an hour. Our boat's not coming to the dock when we're top hook. It wasn't an issue of money. It was an issue of the look. The look you saw in your Father's face. And you either see in his eyes, you have a place in his heart, or you don't. And it all depends if you're acting the way you should. And if you're doing all the things you should do, that's my boy. But if you're not, you don't have a right to be. And I didn't realize, all the way into my 20s now, the destructive habit pattern of thinking continues to get bigger and bigger, wider and wider, as a fortress of thought, a stronghold, is being built for the next 20 years that will exalt itself above the knowledge of God's love. I became known as Captain Bligh, a rageaholic at sea. Because if my crew did anything to hinder us from being the top boat, I would explode and rage at them. Nobody could work for me. Nobody wanted to be on my vessel with me. Because when this boat went out, when we come back, our name's going to be at the top of that chalkboard. Now, an interesting thing, in 7 years of fishing, over a year's period of time, throughout the Carolina coast, after we moved the boat from Florida to the Carolinas, in 7 years, we were never outfished over a year's period. We almost lost our lives many of times. I've been offshore in 70-mile-an-hour winds, 25, 30-foot seas. I've had the boat turned over on its side, upside down at least a half a dozen times. I've been offshore where 3 boats offshore in the middle of the night. When the storm hits, by sunrise, we're the only ones left alive. Because when we go to sea, we're not coming back until we're top hook. So by 27 years old, I'm making $50,000 a year going fishing. Now, we're not fishing nets, men. How many fishermen we've got here? We're fishing hook and line, commercial reels. We're catching groupers up to 400 pounds. I would take a 15-pound mahi-mahi live, put it down for bait on a wreck, and come up with a 300 or 400-pound grouper. I mean, fun. But making everybody's life miserable the whole time they're at sea, and nobody could work for me. Finally, we got on one bite of fish. We call it the Devil's Hole off of Georgetown, South Carolina. Because 3 boats had disappeared there in the 70s. We got on a bite of fish there, had caught about 2,000 pounds of snapper, and then a school of grouper moved in and started eating the snapper. We caught 28 fish in 4 hours that weighed over 5,000 pounds. They were about 2,000 pounds each, or 200 pounds each. The biggest one, 315. Boat was loaded down. I called in a friend of mine, Brian, on the Ranger 4, and he got on them. We headed back a few days before Christmas, 1979. Made it on back right in time for a northeaster to come in, and it was blowing, and I'd hoped Brian made it back. I headed on home, and Brian came into Charleston, and I was coming into up near Wilmington, North Carolina. And it was Christmas morning, 10:30. I'll never forget the phone call as the boat owner's wife called and said, "Have you seen Brian on the Ranger 4? I left him on the Devil's Hole. He was in these giant groupers, these Warsaw groupers, or you're the last boat to hear from him." They never found him, never found a life jacket. 4 men disappeared completely off the face of the earth. It's not uncommon to commercial fishermen. But that year I'd lost over 10 friends. That year had been the worst year of my life. My son was born that year, and I was a rageaholic even with a little baby. I couldn't even hardly risk coming home because of the anger that would come forth at a 6-month, 8-month, a 1-year-old child. So I lived at sea, just wiped out on drugs and alcohol, cocaine. But as my friends died around me that year, I couldn't stand it anymore. On February 16th, 1980, at the lowest point in my life, outwardly successful, had the respect of my father, had the respect of my peers. Everybody hated me, but I had the respect. And I went offshore of Wilmington, North Carolina, about 40 miles offshore, right about where we were at back in November together. I had the Doobie Brothers on. I was a rock and roll freak, and a bunch of drug addicts, pothead Doobie Brothers, rock and rollers. I had them playing, and my wife had been telling me about this guy Jesus, this guy I hadn't grown up with. I'd grown up in a church, but I hadn't heard about being born again or having an experience of salvation. And I didn't want anything to do with that. I wouldn't want anything to do with church. I wouldn't go near Christians. I was married at sea on my boat, 1975. But offshore, as the Doobie Brothers began to sing, "Jesus is just all right with me, Jesus is just all right, oh yeah," I began to scream at God. You know, it's okay to do that. And I began to just scream out loud all this anger. Everything I'd wanted to be in life, I'd become, and everything I'd hated as a child, I had also become. And I'd always said, I will never treat my children the way my dad treated me. And before my son's even a year old, I realized I had much greater rage and anger than my father ever had. And as I screamed and I cried out to God, I was at the lowest place in my life, and that all my relationships were shattered. As I cried out to God, all I can say, it was like sitting in Mr. Mullen's lap. I wasn't on my knees. I didn't pray a sinner's prayer. I'd left my crew at home. I was 40 miles offshore of land alone. And just perfect love filled that vessel. And I wept for the first time in 15 years. I stopped crying at 12. Men don't cry. Be a man. And for 3 days, I couldn't stop weeping. I just fished, talked to God. I didn't know how to pray. I wasn't raised around that. And I just talked to God, and I wept, and I wept, and I wept. And see, at the lowest place in my life is when I experienced God's unconditional love. I came home, my best friend jumped on the boat, fired up a joint, marijuana cigarettes, had smuggled in 6,000 pounds last night. A lot of the fishing boats do that. Handed it to me. I said, I don't need that anymore. What happened to you? And I told him what had happened for 3 days. I didn't even know what it meant to be born again. I'd never heard the phrase saved. I'd never heard the phrase born again, 27 years old. He said, I was raised in a Holy Roller Church in Ohio, and I'll tell you what happened to you. You were born again. And then I went home and told my wife, let's go to church. And she couldn't believe it. She took me to a little church she grew up in, a holiness church, an old-time holiness church with about 20 people. all over 60 with blue hair. And I walk in there with this